Alright, so our first theory, or our first model, we're going to call it the preferences model of Congress. And you don't need to know who came up with it. It's a guy, I'm probably going to embarrassingly misspell his name. In my defense, it's a hard name. It's a guy by the name of Keith Kriebel who came up with this. And what he said is, if you want to understand Congress, then look at the individual members. So point one, look at individual members. Forget parties. We're not going to deal with parties. We're not going to talk about parties. Republican, Democrat. For Kriebel and for this preferences model, parties do not matter. We forget all about parties. And instead of looking at parties, we look at the individual members of Congress and their, well, preferences. So that's why we call it the preferences model, because we're looking at the preferences of the individual members of Congress. So, okay, how do we do that? Well, hopefully I can find a tool here. Maybe I can't. I don't do this very much. Drawing. Okay, maybe I can insert a drawing here. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line. Alright, and here's our line. It's mostly level. So what we do is we use a one line or one-dimensional line, just a line, okay? So we're not, doing a Cartesian plot where you have x and y coordinates. It's just one line. And we put the most liberal member over here and the most conservative member over there on the right-hand side. So here we're going to say Bernie Sanders. I think he's probably the most liberal member of the Senate. And here I'm going to say Ted Cruz or Rand Paul. One of those two is the most conservative member. So everybody in between is less liberal than Bernie Sanders and less conservative than Rand Paul. And somewhere in the middle here is number 50. Well, if we were in the House, remember there'd be no filibuster. So what we would say is we're forgetting about parties. And so all we have is the median voter. That person who's right in the middle. That member gets to determine what passes and what doesn't pass. If they sign up for it, it passes. If they don't, it doesn't. So the median member would call the shot. And we're going to say here the median member for the Senate is a guy named Pat Roberts. I don't know if that's true or not, but it makes sense. Alright. But the problem is we have the filibuster, and that's where things get interesting. And I'm going to spare you all the details of spatial voting, but just know that when you're dealing with this model, you have to take into account the rules of the Senate. If you're dealing with the Senate, you have to take into account that you have to clear the filibuster. So all of a sudden, number 60, the person you need to sign on to break that filibuster, remember you get 60 votes and you break the filibuster, you tell the person to be quiet, they sit down, they stop talking, and you take the vote and pass the legislation. Well, what it means is we're looking at the individual preferences of the members of the Senate, and we're saying, how do we craft our legislation so that we can get the 60th member to say okay. When you get the 60th member to say okay, then you have your legislation and you can pass it. And I'm not even going to get into the presidential veto and overriding a veto. If you'd like to, you can think about that. And again, you can take that into consideration. The hint is you got to look at member number 66 to override the presidential veto. But, that gets a little bit more complicated. We'll just say for now, if you think the preferences model is what defines everything, or you really buy into this model, you're saying forget parties, and it's the individual members of the Senate. Now again, I'm saying the Senate. right? All of my examples here are the Senate, and it's because this model works better for the Senate. In the House, it's a little bit harder. We would just say the median member calls the shots on everything because there's no filibuster. So, an example of where this would work, where I would say this model works, is when George W. Bush tried to nominate a woman named Harriet Miers for the Supreme Court. Members of his own party rejected that. They said, we don't trust her, we don't like her, we're not going to support her. Now, all the Democrats were lining up to say, hey, all right, we won't support her. This will be a loss for the president. That's a good thing. But also, some Republicans lined up. So, what we would say is that she did not even get the support of her own party. What that means is it wasn't party based. The vote was actually based more so on what the individual members were thinking and their individual preferences. So that's a good. Whoops! I just deleted something. That's a good example of where I believe that parties maybe mattered less and individual preferences mattered more. I think I'm spelling her name correctly. The Harriet Miers nomination. Now, what's an example of this model not working? Party switchers. There's been a few times when somebody's gone from being a Democrat to a Republican or a Republican to a Democrat. And what you see happen is their votes change a lot. And that doesn't make much sense because, did their preferences all change overnight? Well, not really. What happened is, there is some party line voting going on. So this model can't explain everything. It can't explain party switchers, but it can explain some things. And if you want to see what it can explain, look at the votes on some stuff, and when you see party line voting not happening, when you see not all the Democrats vote for and all the Republicans against, or all the Republicans vote for and all the Democrats against, when you don't see that, then this model is probably going to be really useful. And again, the key thing, this model is saying just look at the preferences of the individual members of the governing body. In this case, we're using the Senate. Okay, I hope that helps.